Today, Pierce Mill is a familiar sight in Rock Creek Park and the last working grist mill in Washington, D.C. But in the early 20th century, Pierce Mill was a tea house where patrons enjoyed tea and waffles in the rustic stone building beside Rock Creek. In the summer of 1920, an African American woman named Hattie Sewell was awarded a contract to run the tea house at Pierce Mill. Sewell paid monthly rent and increased business at the mill. But a prominent neighbor, E.S. Newman, complained that the mill was becoming a rendezvous for colored people, soon developing into a nuisance. In October 1921, park managers canceled Hattie Sewell's contract to run the tea house at Pierce Mill. But who was Hattie Sewell? How did she come to run the tea house? And what happened after her contract was unfairly canceled? And most importantly, what does Hattie Sewell's experience teach us about what it meant to be a Black woman and an entrepreneur in 1920? 100 years after Hattie Sewell left Pierce Mill, this film explores some of those questions. The 1880 census provides the first clue about Hattie Sewell's life. At age 10, her name was Hattie Ridley. She and her mother, Rena, lived in the booming railroad town of Dallas, Texas. Both were domestic workers in the home of T.K. Ferguson, an Irish immigrant. Rena cooked and did the wash. At just 10 years old, Hattie was the nurse looking after the Fergusons' 3 children, ages 8, 6, and 1. Hattie, though still just a girl herself, had joined a large female labor workforce of African American cooks, maids, and laundresses. 15 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, 3 out of 4 Black women in Texas worked outside the home. Fewer than 1 in 7 white women held jobs. By 1900, Hattie and Rena Ridley had built new lives for themselves in the territory of Arizona. They were early participants in the Great Migration of African Americans away from the Deep South. 6 million would eventually migrate, hoping to escape stifling segregation and find new economic opportunities. Hattie Ridley settled in Phoenix, where she joined a tiny African American population. At the turn of the 20th century, fewer than 3% of the city's residents were Black. Hattie married John W. Bolton, and together they had a son, Chauncey, born in 1893. They are the only African American family listed on this 1900 census form. The Boltons owned a home near the center of Phoenix. J.W. Bolton operated a barbershop called Adams Shaving Parlors in the Hotel Adams, the grand balcony building on the left. After working several years as a barber, Bolton passed the civil service exam to become a mail carrier. But he suffered from a persistent lung ailment and died in December 1902 at the age of 35. The local newspaper ran an article about J.W. Bolton's untimely death and noted that he leaves a wife and little son Chauncey, both well known in the community. Hattie and her son remained in Phoenix after J.W. Bolton's death. A 1905 Maricopa County school census lists Chauncey Bolton as one of the only Black students enrolled. As a recent widow, Hattie Bolton also saw to the musical education of her only child. Young Chauncey Bolton studied piano at the Arizona School of Music. A local Phoenix newspaper chronicled his performances. At a recital in January of 1906, 13-year-old Chauncey played this song, a popular tune called the Dance of the Brownies. Hattie Bolton eventually moved south to Tucson, Arizona, and met Samuel Fletcher Sewell, a soldier stationed at Fort Huachuca near the Mexican border. In the 19-teens, Fort Huachuca was home to the 10th Cavalry, the celebrated all-black regiment whose reputation in the American West earned them the nickname Buffalo Soldiers. Sewell served at Fort Huachuca at the same time as Major Charles Young, the third black graduate of West Point and the first African-American National Park Superintendent. Samuel Sewell and Hattie Bolton married in Tucson on December 13, 1915. A few months after their wedding, Samuel's regiment crossed the southern border in pursuit of the Mexican general and revolutionary Pancho Villa. The Mexican expedition lasted less than a year, but the United States would soon be drawn into a conflict on the other side of the globe. In 1917, as the country prepared to enter World War I, the U.S. government encouraged African Americans to enlist. Many black soldiers saw the war as a chance to prove themselves in combat overseas and to fight discrimination at home. African American leaders in D.C. urged the Secretary of War to desegregate military training camps. Instead, the Army created a separate Jim Crow camp for black officers at Fort Des Moines in Iowa. Samuel Sewell was among the officers selected to train at Fort Des Moines in 1917. An article in the Iowa Bystander featured a photo of Captain Sewell describing him as a man of political influence in his state. As the country entered World War I, Sewell and his fellow officers underwent 4 months of rigorous training at Fort Des Moines. When they graduated in October 1917, Samuel Sewell was one of just 160 African American soldiers to earn the rank of captain. It was Samuel's military career that first brought the Sewells east to the Washington area. In October 1917, Captain Sewell was transferred, along with other African American officers, to Camp Meade in Maryland. But Army leadership perceived experienced officers like Samuel Sewell as a threat, and new black recruits were often assigned menial tasks. Black leaders charged President Woodrow Wilson with hypocrisy. They contrasted his lofty goals for the war in Europe with the treatment of black soldiers and citizens. Archibald Grimke, president of the D.C. chapter of the NAACP, asked, "Is our country at war to make the world safe for democracy, irrespective of the race or color of its multitudinous peoples? Or has our country declared war against Germany merely to make the world safe for white peoples?" Despite the hardships they faced, many African American soldiers would go on to fight bravely in Europe, but Samuel Sewall was not among them. In April 1918, just 6 months after completing the officer training at Fort Des Moines, Samuel Sewall was discharged from the Army. The official record lists the cause as disability. In May 1918, shortly after Captain Sewell's discharge, Samuel and Hattie purchased a home at the corner of 13th Street and Riggs in Northwest DC. They operated the large brick building as a boarding house. In Arizona, the Sewells were part of a tiny African American population. A quarter of Washington residents were black. Hattie and Samuel lived near U Street, the backbone of DC's vibrant middle-class black community. The Sewells moved to DC in 1918 at the dawn of a cultural rebirth for black Americans. There were over 300 black-owned businesses in their new neighborhood, and an inventive music called jazz could be heard in the clubs and cabarets along U Street, not far from Hattie and Samuel's home. But the Sewells also arrived in D.C. during the last years of the Wilson administration, which segregated federal government agencies and deepened racial inequalities. When President Warren G. Harding came to office in 1921, black Washingtonians hoped for change, but the new administration let most of the inequalities stand. Still, as World War I ended, African American leaders in DC saw opportunities to fight entrenched racism in the nation's capital and across the country. Black women, like Nannie Helen Burroughs, were at the forefront of these efforts. Using their proximity to the federal government and influence, they campaigned for nationwide change. Burroughs fought to earn women the right to vote, joining a movement that led to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Nannie Helen Burroughs also established the National Training School for Women and Girls in Northeast DC, which provided vocational education in cooking, sewing, and housekeeping, which were the only kinds of jobs available to most African American women. Burroughs and other female leaders promoted economic opportunities for black women in Washington, women like Hattie Sewell, who built businesses for themselves, their families, and their communities. Black veterans also advocated for social change. During World War I, African American soldiers fought for democracy overseas. After the war, they advocated for those same ideals at home. Though he did not serve in Europe, Samuel Sewall helped establish an organization for black veterans. Formed in the winter of 1919, the Grand Army of Americans sought to promote the cause of democracy throughout the United States.
I'm going to lay down this heavy
Black veterans like Samuel Sewell hoped for change, but in the summer of 1919, racial tensions boiled over. Mobs of white Americans attacked black citizens in cities across the country, an angry season known as Red Summer. Shortly after this July 4th celebration, violence would engulf Washington too. Local newspapers stirred hostilities with sensational headlines like this one from July 7th, warning of a Negro fiend prowling the streets of D.C. and attacking women. 4 days later, Captain Samuel Sewell was quoted in the Washington Times. "We gave our lives to make the world free for democracy and a safe place in which to live, and now are ready to make Washington Street safe for womankind to tread." The following week, a white woman accused two black men of trying to steal her umbrella. Washington had reached its boiling point, and anti-black riots erupted throughout the city. Between July 19th and July 22nd, 15 people lost their lives in violence. During the riots, black veterans defended their neighborhoods from the white mobs. What Samuel Sewell did during Red Summer is unknown. The following summer was a quieter one for the Sewells, filled with ordinary family events. Hattie's mother, now known as Mrs. Rena Livingston, traveled east in May to visit her daughter's new home in Washington. Rena's vacation plans were chronicled in a Phoenix newspaper. And Hattie's son, Chauncey Bolton, married Ruth Bonaire in June of 1920. That same summer, Hattie began paying $45 a month to rent the tea house at Pierce Mill. Tea houses and tea rooms were enormously popular in the early 20th century. These casual, charming restaurants were frequented by women and often run by women at a time when there were few opportunities for female entrepreneurs. Tea was only a part of the appeal. The food was usually lighter fare, though many tea houses served chicken and waffles. But tea houses were also about atmosphere. Some seemed vaguely bohemian, others recalled colonial America, and many tea rooms were set in quaint old buildings, such as an old mill. When Hattie Sewell came to Pierce Mill in 1920, the old stone building had stood beside Rock Creek for almost 100 years. But Pierce Mill hadn't ground any grain since 1897, when its wooden machinery broke. Today, the National Park Service manages Pierce Mill as a part of Rock Creek Park, but in the early 20th century, the park was governed by the Office of Public Buildings and Grounds, part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Around 1905, Pierce Mill was converted into a tea house operated by a series of female entrepreneurs. Mary Louise Noble ran the tea house until the fall of 1919, when park managers dismissed her for negligence and failure to pay rent. Park managers needed someone to replace Noble and opened the concession up for bidding. On July 2, 1920, they awarded the contract to run the tea house at Pierce Mill to Hattie Sewell. A week later, Sewell placed this advertisement in the Washington Times. "The old Pierce Mill Tea House, now open to the public. Come out and spend your leisure hours. Nature invites you to hear the gentle ripples of the old mill stream and enjoy the most beautiful garden spot of any capital on earth. Hattie Sewell advertised her new business in the Washington Times, not in one of the city's black-owned newspapers. And in the 1920s, most of Washington's restaurants were segregated, not by law, but by long-standing tradition. So who were Hattie Sewell's customers? Was the tea house at Pierce Mill segregated? There were attempts to segregate Rock Creek Park. In 1922, park managers installed for white only and for colored only signs. After complaints from the NAACP, the signs were quickly removed. Still, the question of segregation at the tea house may never be completely resolved, but at least one person feared that under Hattie Sewell's management, Pierce Mill might become a rendezvous for colored people. E.S. Newman was born during the Civil War and had married into the Pierce family. In 1921, he lived just up the hill from the tea house at the family's Cloverdale mansion. Much of Rock Creek Park had once belonged to the Pierces. In the early 19th century, they built a vast estate, including orchards, a distillery, a sawmill, and a gristmill, using enslaved labor. The Pierces' gristmill was now a tea house, and to Newman's dismay, Hattie Sewell, a black woman, was running the business. Newman wrote a letter of complaint to Rock Creek Park's recently appointed manager, Lieutenant Colonel Clarence O. Sherrill. At first, Sherrill resisted Newman's demands, explaining that the park had received no other complaints about Sewell's management of the tea house, and that she had increased business at the mill by 200%. But Newman persisted, and Sherrill soon relented. In October 1921, Sherrill canceled Hattie Sewell's contract to run the tea house at Pierce Mill. After Hattie Sewell's contract was canceled, Lieutenant Colonel Sherrill needed a new manager for the Pierce Mill tea house, and this time he deliberately avoided open bidding and steered the contract to the Girl Scouts. As Sherrill later explained, competition was not deemed advisable in letting this concession because of the fact that it would be impossible to select or obtain in that way the type of proprietors desired. The party who operated the tea house prior to this concession was the high bidder in a competition. When the Girl Scouts reopened the Pierce Mill Tea House in November 1921, President Harding's wife, Florence, was the guest of honor. The First Lady shared a favorite recipe, and Harding waffles became a Pierce Mill Tea House specialty. In a press release, Sherrill boasted about the new management at Pierce Mill. A delightful air of hospitality will be found always in evidence at the tea house, as the management is directly under a large committee of ladies prominent in Washington society. The annual report of the Army Chiefs of Engineers would later state that Hattie Sewell had given up the contract to run the tea house. After leaving Pierce Mill, Hattie Sewell was able to open up a second business, a cafe at the Balfour, a large apartment building at the corner of 16th and U Streets near Meridian Hill Park. It is not clear how long this restaurant lasted. Hattie Sewell spent just a year and a half at Pierce Mill. Many questions about her story remain, but certain patterns emerged throughout her life. As a young domestic worker in Dallas, and as a mother, then widow in Phoenix, as an Army wife, and as a Black female entrepreneur in Washington, D.C. Throughout her life, Hattie Sewell worked persistently to overcome the constrained roles society had assigned to her as an African American woman. For Black female entrepreneurs like Hattie Sewell, owning a business was a form of activism. But despite her persistence, Hattie Sewell's life was also shaped by the turbulent times in which she lived and by forces beyond her control. Some questions about her life may never be answered, but Hattie Sewell's story will always be a part of Pierce Mill's history.
I have a need for a week. I even walk in my sleep. What's up around me seems to always be. Every night and day, I hang my head and weep, yes, and weep. I love my baby, I want him for myself. If he don't be mine, he won't have nobody else. He has left me, I'll do the best I can. I'ma do right, kid, get a friend any place I land.